Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and I'm with Audrey Waters, and we're at Science Leadership Academy in Philadelphia. And it is the 29th of January, and this is our weekly podcast. Audrey?
We're face-to-face, too, which is...
We are. It's delightful.
I know.
And we've heard about fruitopians.
We have heard about fruitopians, which I don't think either of us, after last week, we aren't qualified to be fruitopians.
Aside from EduCon, the news this week felt to me a little bit like a tennis match between Google and Apple. We keep vacillating in our subjects.
I know. Let's see who will take on this
Is
week.
there anybody else of importance? Let's see.
Pearson.
Yes, how about that? Okay, so tell us why HTML5 is so important.
The company that I wrote about this week was called Desmos, and I like this company a lot. They're a new startup, and they've been building products, which I think this is this really important notion, right? Is that we cannot just have educational content that works on one device. We have to make sure that programs are accessible no matter whether you're using a Mac or a PC, an iPhone or an Android, and in terms of the future of the browser and the web, HTML5 is sort of the latest standard of HTML, and it contains a lot of new things that just make it possible to do really interesting audio, visual things. And it can work offline even, which is, again, in terms of the browser, pretty important if you don't have connectivity to still be able to manipulate things. So Desmos makes a free graphing calculator, which I love because, making families buy a $70 graphing calculator for one high school class, it seems like a great deal for Texas Instruments and probably not such a great deal for students. So a free graphing calculator that works online. The problem was it was Flash. And they recoded the whole tool so that it actually now is HTML5, which means it'll run on any modern browser, which does have to have an asterisk that's not Internet Explorer. but that's another conversation, I think.
Does this in any way tie to Apple's announcement last week? I mean, is there a degree to which this is kind of breaking the monopoly of the app players, so that Apple's sort of positioning themselves to make sure that they are strong in other areas? I
mean, this is one of the things that I think we need to be thinking about in terms of things that work across platform. The web is a cross-platform technology as opposed to an app, and so I think it's really important to for us to think about why we would move things off the web and into an app, which is it's a different sort of walled garden, sort of a technological walled garden. Apps aren't searchable. They aren't indexed by Google, the contents of apps. They live in another, they sort of live off the web, even if they have, internet connectivity. And so I'm a big supporter of people that are turning to the web as the solution, for a number of reasons. But I think that it is, Apple wants things in an app.
Is there a thick client, thin client analogy here? I mean, is there a degree to which there's still going to be value in the phone doing some processing and the web providing the data? Will that exist beyond HTML5?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's actually something really interesting to think about. And I think that the development of HTML5, I mean, I think we're going to have to sort of see where it goes too, because I think if the technology, if the world of tech moves to apps, will HTML5 even be relevant?
I can tell when you like someone, and I know you like Desmos. What's their revenue model?
That is a very good question. Actually, the funny thing about this tool too is initially Desmos wanted to make software that worked both on sort of interactive whiteboards and on the desktop and on mobile devices. And I think that they've been struggling to figure out a revenue model, partially because I think there are lots of systems in play that don't actually want, the folks who sell you interactive whiteboards don't really want the content to be accessible elsewhere, because then why the hell would you buy an interactive whiteboard? So I think that they're in the process of shifting what they're doing. They really like the calculator, partially because the co-founder is a very geeky math guy.
Like 3 degrees or something, right?
And so I think they're still sort of struggling to figure out what they want to do with the calculator. So I think they're at the process of switching.
You know, I don't know if we've mentioned this on the show before, but I tried Google Translate out in its newest incarnation on my phone, and I was kind of shocked. Were you hearing the train rumble by?
I was just making sure we're still recording. We are.
I was kind of shocked at how close the handheld device is getting to the Star Trek Universal Translator, and thinking this is just really an amazing period of time to be thinking about how things get transformed because of this device that we carry around. Okay, so virtual classes versus the physical experience. And so Stanford's AI professor leaves Stanford, which I don't think was any great surprise. And this question of colleges and universities distinguishing themselves, is this maybe a good thing? Meaning, will this lead schools to have to pick ways to define themselves based on their physical interaction when you have these enormous classes available online?
I think that, this is sort of always what MIT argued when they made their content available, the MIT Opencourseware initiative, was what was valuable about MIT was 2 things. I'd say one, you get a degree from MIT, but the other is that campus experience, right? There's something about coming to school with your peers, having a chance to interact with a professor that makes the on-site, face-to-face experience of the university more valuable. What was really interesting in the case of Sebastian Thrun leaving Stanford is he said that the students at Stanford who were actually taking his AI class dropped out of that face-to-face experience in order to do the online. And I don't know enough sort of why that is. I don't know if I've heard people say, well, the online one was easier. Perhaps it fit better with their schedules. I mean, I don't know. But it seemed as though in this particular case, students were opting to do the online massive course rather than be in a classroom with Sebastian Thrun.
So I've heard that referred to as time shifting, and I really buy that, meaning I know there are times of the day that I'm much more likely to want to learn something or to read an article in depth. So that made some sense to me, although it was funny the way it was presented in the article. I actually almost felt like it was the professor whose class was failing who was sort of making an excuse, but clearly that's what was going on. These massive classes, though, at least in this case, this is not actually an open course, right?
No, and this, and I think that this is, I think that that's actually a really important distinction to make too. I think that we've seen the MOOC, right, the massive online open course, become a really interesting and fruitful way to rethink what happens in the classroom, and I think of sort of the learners really guiding sort of where those classes go and take and do interesting things with them. It's pretty clear that what Thrun is doing is not that. In fact, I was looking at the licensing for what happens in the class, and it's copyrighted. It's all locked down. It is still that older model of thinking about the professor driving the conversation rather than the learners.
So I came at that licensing with a little bit of history in terms of licensing with social networking, and it wasn't as draconian to me because of that. The social networking services have to have a certain amount of ownership of the content in order to be able to redisplay user comments, and that's always a little bit tricky. Because who really owns the data of the participants? Yeah,
I think so, but I think that once he's saying that all of the code, like the code itself of the class, and that really is what he's selling here. There's so many interesting backstories going on at Stanford right now. So last term there were 3 classes that were offered online, right? There was the machine learning, the databases, and then Sebastian Thrun's AI class. And the AI class was already run in conjunction with this new startup. The other two stayed Stanford. And two Stanford professors that taught those classes, they built an online learning system to manage these classes. And it's actually not clear if they're going to leave Stanford and run a startup as well. But Thrun had his own thing. So there's actually the code behind the scenes that runs and manages the class that has this, this sort of, that helps deliver the lectures where you sort of submit your homework. And then, of course, it's because it's AI and machine learning that they're actually auto-graded as well.
Oh, wait a minute, robot grading
There is robot grading involved. And so there's actually competition between what appears to be a technology that Stanford owns, or at least Stanford has a stake in, an equity stake, and then Sebastian Thrun's startup, which is now its own beast. So there are things going on with Stanford that it's not clear that sort of Sebastian Thrun said, I can never go back to Stanford. And I think people interpreted that as, once you've taught 160,000 students, sort of your life has changed forever. And I think it's more complicated, and sort of the political machinations behind the scene. There's also other things going on.
So this is intriguing because as these institutions of higher education become players in the marketplace
Mm-hmm.
of education, there's a degree to which they've actually lagged behind.
Mm-hmm.
I was at Stanford a couple of weeks ago, and a woman raised her hand, a professor in the Department of Education, and said, so where do you find all of these educational blogs? And I was like, well, that's kind of a 10 years ago question. And then we described to her the places, and then she said, well, why doesn't Stanford come out with the list of the best educational blogs? I thought, well, that's also a really interesting way of approaching the issue. So there's going to be cutting edge and there's going to be being behind.
Right.
But clearly what I hear you saying is almost like biotech or Silicon Valley. This is a portion of the innovation is going to come from these kinds of individuals, and the universities are going to have to negotiate with them how much takes place in the university and how much takes place outside.
Yeah, and I think that it's fascinating too in terms of thinking about why a student wants. It's back to this MIT proposition. Like, why do you want to go to MIT? Partially because you get a great engineering education, but partially because you get a piece of paper that says, I have a degree from MIT. So what does it mean, too, that students now will have a letter from Sebastian Thrun? And does that hold the same, can you wield that as you could a Stanford?
It will come with a badge.
It will come with a badge.
Okay, so alum.us, alumnus. My first thought was, for those who didn't take Latin, which is going to be the great majority of high school students, are they even going to know what an alumnus is? Nobody thinks of themselves as a high school alumnus.
Which is I think why this particular startup is really fascinating to me, is because I think when we talk about sort of your alma mater, we don't actually. If you went to a public high school, if you went to a private school, actually, you probably do think of yourself as a graduate from a particular private school, and certainly from a university. But there's that missing piece at the public school and at the community college level, which I think it sort of feeds into lots of other issues about lack of community responsibility, feeling of responsibility back to the place where you were educated, in terms of money, in terms of mentoring, in terms of just a network that says, I went here, they did well by me, or they did well for me, and I want to give back. And so I think that it's sort of addressing interesting pieces that we've never really, that we don't address.
I had a good high school experience, but quite candidly, I don't really have a lot of interest in reconnecting with the school.
Mm-hmm.
The people, unlike college, a lot of the people who were there when I was a student aren't there anymore. The turnover is different.
Right.
And classmates.com and some of these other services have already sort of touched this piece of how do you connect with each other.
Yeah.
And I actually created a Ning site for my high school
Mm-hmm.
reunion that probably is the closest we've come to really connecting. I was sort of hot and cold on this. I wasn't really sure I would ever contribute to that old high school.
Well, I think that that's also so the co-founder, I've talked with him about this, and he's because he really is interested in like how do we sort of make schools and the community around a school more sustainable, particularly for public schools. And he said that that's one of the challenges, that if you ask people, do you want to give back to your high school, a lot of people were like, oh my God, no, school, like it was awful.
Right.
And so, I think it's actually uncovering lots of issues about sort of why that is. Or maybe you had one great,
Right.
maybe you had a great French teacher, for example, but she's not there any longer. And so I think it's sort of raising interesting questions about about why don't we have that, why don't we feel a responsibility to the K through 12,
Right.
the K through 12 education the same way that we do college.
So here's an interesting thought. I actually care more about my children's current schools than I do about my old schools. So my relationship with schools is just as passionate. It's just not an alumni relationship. So maybe they thought a lot more about this than I have.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd actually be more interested in this if it was specific to the schools my kids are currently going to.
Yeah, and I have to wonder too if sort of it's one of the world has changed, and I think the fact of a parent going or kids going to the same schools that parents went to. That world.
We're too much of a moving society.
Right.
Or at least in certain social classes.
Yeah. I went to the same junior high and high school that my dad went to.
Interesting. Okay, so on to and Alumnus was another Startup Weekend EDU winner.
They were.
Moving on to MIT's Opencourseware Scholar. Okay, this I loved.
Well, I'm a huge fan. I was actually in Boston last week, and I had to go get an MIT T-shirt, even though I have no affiliation with the school.
We'll start getting calls from their development department for contributions.
But I really do think that what MIT is doing, they've been thinking about open education for a long time now, and again recognizing that it's not enough to just post the course materials online.
Well, didn't you report that they were mostly being used by the current students more than they were being used outside?
Right, or students in some class. And so what the MIT Opencourseware Scholar is a new initiative that's sort of how can we really make sure that if you don't have resources, right, if you aren't a college student elsewhere, sort of using the MIT Opencourseware materials to supplement your own classes, how can we really support informal learners? And so they're working on developing these Scholar courses that are sort of just it's just beefing up the Opencourseware materials. Partially they have TAs, which is really interesting. This isn't just the university giving it away. They're actually putting a lot of resources into this, and they have study groups. They're really trying to make sure that people who want to learn from these materials have a community of fellow learners and some access, not to the professor necessarily, but to TAs, which is, I think, really exciting.
And study groups.
Yeah,
I love this idea, and I have to say my first thought was homeschoolers, that this is something they could eat up.
Yeah.
Okay, so you actually posted about our weekly podcast, and you said the anger in your voice in this episode was palpable. I ordered the book, The Consent of the Networked, which just arrived before I left on this trip, and I haven't had a chance to crack it open yet. But I am interested in this sort of assumption we have of positive outcomes from technology. And if you look back at the history of technologies, there's this sort of bubble period where we believe that radio or TV is going to sort of democratize everything, and then it becomes proprietary.
Right.
So, where are the hot points here? Where do we need to be nervous and be thinking about things?
And I think we need to be nervous and thinking about things at almost every turn. I don't mean to sort of sound overly dramatic, but I think that when we look at sort of the budgets for schools being axed and the sort of influx in new new technologies that are sort of promising the fix for education. I think that we just need to be very mindful of sort of what's happening financially and thinking about the impacts of who's investing in what and why.
So we're going to go out of order here a little
I know.
because
That
the
was a
anger
good
from
way.
last week sort of was continued this week with another announcement that I really think set your teeth on edge. This was the Startup Weekend EDU announcement of Pearson's association with them.
Yeah, I have been a big fan of Startup Weekends for a long time. In fact, longer than since before they started focusing on education. Partially because I think that it's just a great learning opportunity to spend the weekend thinking about what it means to be an entrepreneur and to develop a product, to actually build something over the course of the weekend, pitch your idea, work on, finding out, does anyone even want this idea, doing a little bit of customer development. It's a really powerful experience. People don't come with sort of preformed teams. I mean, you actually are having to sort of build a team, build a product, think through building customers. I think it's a really important and exciting learning experience for those people. And when they decided to focus on education, I was thrilled, partially because I think we don't, it's very rare that entrepreneurs and engineers and educators sit in the same room, work on the same team to solve a problem together. People are sort of off in separate corners, whether working to solve a problem or inventing things that people might want to buy. And so to see the investment from Pearson, just I think for a project that is real, or this initiative is I think less than 6 months old, to see Pearson already step in, it certainly makes me, well, I think I called it breaks my heart, but it makes me very reluctant to participate in those events.
But I mean, I think there was some concern specifically around the mentoring, at least for me, kind of the close association. So I felt that we went through this with open source software in education to a degree, which is we discovered that a lot of our motivation for open source software was actually to disrupt the system. It turns out that we were using open source as a channel. I think ed tech is kind of the same thing. We sort of see educational technology as an opportunity to change the status quo. So it felt like part of the disappointment here was just realizing that what we had seen as a disruptive force may not actually end up being disruptive. The Startup Weekend EDU.
Right. I mean, I think that this is one of the interesting shifts that we're seeing, particularly with the rise of sort of new consumer technology, is that for a long time the model of distribution of products in the classroom was very much top down. Right. The district would buy whiteboards. The district would buy textbooks. The district would buy computers. And the consumer technology was actually reaching students, reaching teachers, in a very sort of more grassroots adoption of tools. And so I think that that's interesting because those are actually the users. The customer is the user, as opposed to in that old model, the customer is the district and the customer isn't the user. And so thinking about what it means to sort of put tools in the hands, help build tools that go in the hands of students and teachers is very different now than this addition of Pearson's money, which is sort of saying, we're going to help you get your product back in the hands of the districts. And I think that's sort of the promise of what they say, is that we'll teach you how to sell to school districts.
Well, so inherent in that is not changing the distribution model, meaning we've sort of seen that one of the difficulties we've talked about with educational startups is how do they actually get into an ecosystem that seems to be largely built around institutional decision makers. So I can see where Startup Weekend EDU, it feels like, okay, we're bringing people in, and the only really tangible way for them to get into the decision-making process or the buying process, but I'm not sure we really want that buying process to continue.
Exactly. I mean, I think that that's precisely the point, and I think that, Pearson being able to say they can sort of help, help help innovate and help steer the conversation to sort of improve.
Is that steam coming out of your ears?
Well, I mean, this is the business of education, right? Pearson isn't about learning or teaching. They're about the business of
But
education.
I'm sure they tell the story that they are about teaching and learning. I mean, that's got to be a part of their internal culture. It's just a very different view of how you actually help there. I don't want to draw too close a parallel, but I couldn't help but think about Wall Street and the idea of having the people who've caused the problem solve the problem. So, without going too deeply there.
No, I mean, and I think that's it's so funny because almost every education startup that I know right now is building something that Pearson also builds, and that what they want to do is make it better, make it cheaper, go directly to the, build what the teachers and the students want instead of this other model. And so Pearson is actually the competitor of almost every startup, and they are sort of part of the reason why things aren't great today is the textbooks, the testing, the forced mandated curriculum, and that's Pearson.
It's.
I mean, it's not just Pearson,
Right.
but it is almost just
But
Pearson.
it's really easy to follow the money and realize just how much motivation gets built around job security, promotion. I mean, it's not as though anybody in these companies is trying to do anything that they would feel is not appropriate.
Right.
It's just money motivates, and more money motivates more, and do you really want that driving the system? If Pearson were to do one or two things that would shift this in your own mind, what could they do to actually change your perception of their association with Startup Weekend EDU?
Oh, man.
Drop out? No, I mean, could they, one of the suggestions I made was that they actually get a group of former attendees of the Startup Weekends and a group of educators together and say, what role can we play here? If they really want to be authentic players rather than sort of vulture capitalists, right? The response I'm getting is, listen, Pearson doesn't even look at small projects like this. They would never consider buying. There actually is an authentic desire to help here. So if there's an authentic desire to help, can you manifest that in some real way? Could you actually bring people together and say, what can we do? And we're not going to, we're going to follow your guidance. Would that make a difference? I
mean, I think that it might be the first gesture, but I think we are talking about like a multi-billion-dollar company here, and it's a bit like asking, sort of more metaphors here, but it's a bit like sort of having a problem in your small town with the garbage pickup and asking like the Department of Energy from the federal government to come in. I mean, I just don't think that the size of Pearson and the goals of Pearson are really about that answering sort of these local, small community questions and problems.
But there are precedents for large organizations making their staff available to do mentoring and guidance that are clearly outside of any financial interest.
Well, and I've mentored 3 or 4 startup weekend EDUs. I mean, that was me offering my expertise because I care, which is really different than me giving a bunch of money and saying, now you really get my expertise.
Well, if anybody's listening, hopefully we've given you some food for thought. Okay, on to one of our other favorite topics, the Chromebook.
Yes.
Okay, so hundreds of schools. There was something about that just sort of said to me, we're celebrating a grain of sand on a beach.
Well, this was funny because Google contacted me and said, we're going to be making an announcement at FETC about Chromebooks. And I thought, oh man, didn't I just predict that Chromebooks were going away this year? And I don't think Chromebooks are going away because they're in hundreds of schools.
We should put this in context. I mean, how many schools are using Google Apps for education? Do we know?
I think that there are, Google says there are 15 million Google Apps for education users.
And so hundreds of schools would actually translate into how many possible users? 27,000 students,
Well, they're getting
I think?
27,000. They said that was one of their other numbers that they said is 27,000 more students will get Chromebooks in 3 states. I don't remember which.
And how many iPads are there out there being used in schools?
Lots and lots.
Okay, so the only thing I wanted to say was nobody's going to tell you months in advance they're closing a program down, right?
Well,
and maybe they don't even know.
Well, and you don't actually, I mean, that was sort of, you don't actually go to FETC to make a big announcement, which is like, oh, guess what?
Yeah.
You know, these great cloud-based devices, yeah, we're done with that.
Well, so, you know, my thought was you might even work in that group and not know that the axe is coming, and you're going to continue to tout the program until it finally comes. Not that I'm hoping for that, and
no,
especially after the announcements of the devices, you know, earlier, a couple of weeks ago.
Well, I mean, and one interesting, I mean, I did talk to Rajan Sheth, who is now the head of the Chromebook, or the Chrome OS team, and he actually was the inventor of Google Apps. And so he, you know, he made the argument that you know, schools adopting Google Apps for education was very slow, but then they reached this critical mass, and now, you know, now it's really successful. And so his argument was, it's a sort of a slow and steady, this is what we're expecting. We didn't expect sort of, I don't know, thousands of schools. We only expected dozens of schools, no. So he says that this is sort of, they're seeing the same adoption that they saw with Google Apps, for what it's worth.
Yeah,
I mean,
and again, I don't want to presume any understanding of something we don't understand or I don't understand. Right. But certainly the Google of 2 years ago is not the Google of today. They've been much quicker to close programs down. So I'm not sure I would let your prediction go just yet. I don't think you have to raise the white flag yet. Okay, so I'm so thrilled about Google Plus being open to teens.
Yeah, I'm glad too. I mean, this was, again, one of those things that I wasn't sure what Google was going to do. And when they launched the social network, they said, you know, 18 and older. And I think that there's a lot of really great possibilities for Google Plus in the classroom, particularly the integration with, you know, with the Google Apps, the ability to do Hangouts in your classroom, the ability to, you know, to the equivalent of sort of Skyping people in, working on documents together. It is great. It's a good move on Google's part. Will teens use it? I don't know. And will schools use it? Again, I don't know. It's funny looking at Bradley Horowitz's. He posted it on Google Plus, the announcement saying that they were opening it up, and yet there were, you know, hundreds of comments, and most of them were like, you know, oh my God, don't ever let children on the internet sort of comments. And so I still think, you know, that there's a lot of resistance to giving teens access to social networks.
But it seems like Google's also willing to do some education.
I think so, and I think that they've also made some, you know, I think they've moved forward thoughtfully, which is what they said they would do. They weren't sure they had it right for kids, and there are several things now. Teens, for example, there are some restrictions on sort of who can chat with teens, who can reach out and IM with them, and so I think they are trying to make sure that this is you know, quite a safe place for them to be.
One of my big gripes with ePals has been their rollout of programs, especially their email program to large districts, that define down to grade level and individuals who you can and cannot email.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like a student coming out of that environment, at say at the end of high school, hasn't actually made choices and decisions. They've been sort of boxed in because of adult fears. And so how do we get this balance of actually teaching appropriate use without creating every boundary that needs to be there?
Right, and I think that's one of the great things about having this be Google is this is the open web. This isn't even Facebook, which is, I realize, a website, but it is still sort of walled off from other things. And so I think that, you know, getting students thinking about what it means to comment, what it means to write publicly. What does public even mean? What does it look like? You know, how do your things appear in search now that they're changing the way search works? And so I think it is important to have students really start thinking critically about their online presence. And I don't mean in a scary sort of like you post a bad picture on Facebook that you'll never get a job and you won't get into college. But I do think that students need to be thinking about this, because they are, if they're not doing it at school, they are certainly doing it at home in the evening.
Okay, so President Obama was long on platitudes and short on honest talk. What, is this an election year or something?
Wow, I'm so angry. What was that?
Next week we promise we'll be upbeat.
I know. Please somebody has some good news for us. But no, I was actually shocked to hear that we were going to criminalize dropping out of school. Like that, to me, that just seemed to fly in the face of almost everything we know about actually why that happens, right? Why kids don't drop out of school because they're lazy or even because they hate school and we need to sort of force them to stay there. There are a lot of reasons, and they have to do with poverty, and they have to do with real tragedy that kids experience in their lives. And so to criminalize being a teenager just strikes me as another example that President Obama and his policies are just really out of touch with what's happening at schools.
We're getting some people coming in the room. We don't know if you may end up pausing. David Wiley.
Yes.
Utah and open everything.
How funny is it that everyone can be so excited about $14.99 iBook textbooks, and lo and behold, when you make it open source, when you make it shareable, looks like Utah now is going to be able to have textbooks for its math, science, and language arts teachers at $5 a pop, which is certainly a better deal than the $14.99 we were supposed to think was so wonderful.
Yes. Those feel like the real innovations.
Yes.
Okay, one school, which led me to thinking about independent, non-pedagogical applications.
Mm-hmm. This is an interesting one too. This is a new startup that's taking a bunch of university data in order to sort of build mobile apps around campus life. So it's what classes are available, where's the bookstore, what's the sports schedule. But what's interesting is that they're actually having to scrape this from the web. So they don't have a deal with the universities to get this information. They're having to sort of,
which seemed really brilliant to me.
I think so too. But it's this other indication of, if schools aren't providing sort of an API or a way to get the data, we can get the data. And so sort of leaving the schools out of sort of, there's no way for sort of schools to make money off of this, because they're trying to keep all of their data behind a wall.
Yeah, I loved it. It made me think of all kinds of ways in which we've been, I've had blinders on related to what kinds of things you could do at school around mobile technology. Okay, libraries sitting down with publishers to talk.
No, I think this is actually really important. We've talked a lot about the ways in which just over the last year, most of the major publishers have either prevented their ebooks from being lent, prevented audiobooks from being lent, saying that that the business model around libraries doesn't work once content is digitized. And so the ALA had their midwinter meeting this past week, and they said that we need to sit down and sort of figure this out. That librarians cannot just be beholden to these sort of new rules that the publishers are making up. And so I think they'll be meeting face to face with several of the big publishers, and the ones right now that don't allow ebooks in the library, to figure things out.
Interesting. It wasn't a huge shock to me that ISTE's closing down their Second Life island.
Sometimes I'm shocked that there's still Second Life.
So what's the deal there? I mean, isn't this sort of inevitable, the immersive world's technology, and Google closed down their one app that teachers were using, and ISTE's closing down what was a pretty well-publicized initiative. Is it going away, or just sort of submerging for a while?
Well, I think that there's lots of things in play. I mean, part of it is I think that that sort of really processor and graphic intensive program just doesn't work on everybody's machines, particularly as people, as people move to iPads for one, but to tablets, to netbooks. I mean, it's even hard to run Second Life on a laptop, and so I just think that it's not in the browser. There's no sort of web-based portal to get into Second Life. So it feels like really sort of a really intense, really sort of processing intensive program that just doesn't work for everyone. And Second Life was confusing.
So we've chosen mobility and ubiquity over immersion.
I think so, for now at least. I mean, I don't think that these things are sort of technologically impossible, but I do think that we do have to rethink sort of those trade-offs. And I mean, I even look at video games, and gaming is even sort of rethinking what sort of experience can we give gamers. Do they just have to be sitting at home on their couch with their Xbox? Because certainly the games that you play on your phone, which is where most people play games now, they're very different.
Angry Birds is a very simple game.
It's a very simple game.
Okay, Instructure Canvas and the cloud. So Instructure gets pretty mixed reviews.
Instructure is I would say, a fairly updated version of a fairly old idea of the learning management system. So the software looks great. It's browser, it's a browser based. Some of the code is open source, but it is still very much this old learning management system model, which I think we've talked about before. It may or may not be sort of the future of learning management. But interestingly, they sort of threw down the gauntlet this week. Last year there were some concerns about Blackboard security, and not just that there were sort of security holes. I mean, there's security holes all over the place, but that Blackboard didn't do a very good job of sort of communicating to its users that there were some pretty substantial security holes. So Instructure sort of has seized upon this as a great PR thing for them. They did a security audit. They fixed the things that the security firm found, and they said, why isn't the LMS industry as a whole sort of having these open security audits? We can't keep this sort of behind closed doors and not telling our customers.
It's a good horn for them to toot.
It's a great horn for them to toot.
So, well, again, the full disclosure needs to be made. I do work part-time for Blackboard since they bought Illuminate. But I am interested kind of in the inevitability of a shift in terms of large-scale deployments with the cloud.
Well, and I think that this is the thing that they were very concerned about, sort of getting people to talk about the security issue. But that's this other piece that is interesting. Once you move away from a local on-site deployment to cloud-based, it's one of the reasons why the Google Apps is so great, right? Is that Google rolls out an update, and you don't have to walk around the room installing the new CD onto everybody's machine.
Okay, we're getting close to the timing here. I think we've got a minute or two left. My data and students downloading my data button and students downloading their own data. I loved this until I read 3 names.
I know. Guess who?
Do we really have to go back to it again?
Well, this is actually, I think this is a really exciting idea. This is the Department of Veteran Affairs made a blue button, and there's this idea that vets should be able to, with one click of the button, download all their health records. And it's your data. You should be able to get it out. You should own your data. And now the government is sort of looking at how they can implement that idea in other sectors. But right now, leading the conversation is Pearson and Parchment, which is actually a new startup run by the founder of Blackboard.
Something I didn't know. Again, full disclosure.
So the folks who are involved in sort of saying what this looks like, I mean, I don't feel like not everyone's at the table. A very select group of companies are at the table. Interesting.
Okay, I think we should probably end there. Audrey, we'll hope for a smile next week.
Yes, let's hope that there's something fabulous coming that we haven't heard about yet. We'll see.
Thanks. Have a great week, everybody.
Thanks, Steve.
Sorry, you guys. Thanks for being so quiet.